The Atlantic stretched endlessly beneath a gray winter sky, its surface rippled by icy winds that cut through the soul. The destroyer, HMS Walker, prowled those dark waters like a predator. Radar humming, sonar pinging, searching for the faintest trace of an enemy beneath the waves. It was early 1943, the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, and every convoy that crossed from America to Britain carried not just supplies, but the lifeline of a nation under siege. Below that same sea, a German U-boat lurked silently, its crew tense and exhausted. They had been tracking Allied convoys for days, waiting for a chance to strike. But what they didn't know was that death was already circling above them. War made hunters of men, but tonight, both sides would learn what it meant to be human. If you're new here, make sure to hit like and subscribe, so that stories like this one, stories of courage and compassion, never fade from memory. Deep below the surface, the German submarine U-264 crept through the shadows, her engines humming softly. Inside, the air was thick with diesel and sweat. The men had been underwater for more than 30 hours, nerves stretched to breaking. The captain, overloaded Klaus Berger, watched his instruments closely. He knew the British destroyers above were faster, but they couldn't see him. Not yet. One mistake, one wrong sound, and the Atlantic itself would become their tomb. Suddenly, a metallic echo pulsed through the hull, the unmistakable sound of sonar. The destroyer had found them. The crew froze. Seconds later, the sea erupted with explosions. Depth charges hammered the submarine, bursting with concussive force. Lights flickered, pipes screamed, and cold water began to seep through the rivets. The U-boat dove deeper, but the destroyer didn't stop. Again and again, the charges fell, each one closer than the last. The men inside prayed in whispers, clutching the steel around them like it could save their souls. Above, the destroyer's captain leaned over the chart, eyes locked on the sonar trace. "She's wounded," he muttered. "Let's finish it." Through the cold mist of dawn, HMS Walker broke through the churning waves. The U-boat surfaced, battered and bleeding oil, its steel hull fractured from the relentless pounding below. For a brief moment, silence ruled the sea, until both crews saw each other through binoculars. Two enemies separated only by fate and water. "Open fire," came the British order. Cannons roared. Shells tore into the submarine's conning tower, ripping through metal. But the U-boat, in one last desperate maneuver, tried to dive again. It was too late. The destroyer surged forward at full speed. The bow of Walker crashed into the submarine's side with a screech of steel on steel, a violent collision that sent shudders through both vessels. Men were thrown from their stations, waves erupted skyward, and in seconds, the U-boat began to roll and sink into the depths. From above, the British sailors watched as the dark silhouette slipped beneath the surface. "She's gone," whispered one of them. The crew cheered, but the captain didn't. He knew what that meant. Dozens of men trapped below, drowning in silence. The hunt was over, or so they thought. The ocean calmed, but the air was heavy with the echo of destruction. Oil slicks and debris floated across the gray water, wooden planks, a torn life vest, and the faint shimmer of human hope. Then, from the distance, came a sound that cut through the sea's silence. Screams. At first, the crew thought it was the wind, but as they leaned over the rail, they saw them German sailors clinging to debris, shouting for help, their voices hoarse and broken. The icy Atlantic was merciless. In those waters, a man could survive 4 minutes before his body went numb. "Sir," said one British officer softly, "there are survivors." The captain stared into the fog. He knew the rules. U-boat crews had sunk British hospital ships, merchant convoys, even lifeboats. Many of his own men had lost friends to them. And yet, what he saw now were not enemies. They were men, freezing, terrified, and dying before his eyes. He turned away from the deck, his jaw tight. The sea demanded choices no one should ever have to make. Captain Donald McIntyre stood motionless on the bridge of HMS Walker, his breath forming mist in the frigid air. The cries from the water were growing weaker. His crew looked to him, waiting for an order, rescue, or leave them. The manual was clear. No ship should stop to aid the enemy during active combat. U-boats often used survivors as bait, luring destroyers into traps where other submarines waited to strike. Stopping could mean death for everyone on board. McIntyre knew that, but he also knew something deeper, that war didn't erase a man's humanity. "Those are men drowning out there," he finally said. "Lower the boats." His first officer hesitated. "Sir, the Admiralty." I said, "Lower the boats." Within moments, ropes splashed into the freezing sea. British sailors climbed down, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. It was madness, risking their own lives for the men who had tried to kill them. But as the first German sailor was hauled aboard, blue-lipped and shivering, no one spoke of politics, no one spoke of sides. Only survival, and the thin thread of mercy mattered now. The lifeboats rocked violently against the waves as the British sailors reached the struggling Germans. The sea was cruel, tossing them like toys. But they pushed forward, arms outstretched, ropes thrown, pulling men one by one from the freezing abyss. Some of the rescued clung to the ropes with the last of prayers in their native tongue. Others were too weak to move, their eyes vacant, their bodies stiff from cold. The British hauled them aboard anyway, wrapping them in blankets, rubbing their hands, pouring warm tea between trembling lips. One sailor looked at the faces around him, the same faces he'd imagined as monsters in the dark, the same men who'd fired torpedoes at his friends. But here, stripped of weapons and hatred, they were just young men, pale, terrified, and human. A rescued German, barely conscious, grabbed the British sailor's sleeve and murmured, "Danke, thank you." The rescuer didn't answer. He simply nodded, eyes wet with the weight of the moment. That night, under the dim light of the destroyer's deck lamps, enemies became something else, men who shared the same sea, the same fear, and the same fragile breath of life. The weather worsened as night fell, wind howled, waves slammed against the hull, and icy rain stung the sailors' faces like shards of glass. Still, the rescue continued. Floodlights swept across the black water, revealing fleeting glimpses of outstretched arms, desperate faces, and floating wreckage. Men tied ropes around their waists and dove into the water, swimming through chaos to reach the helpless. Every second counted. Every man pulled from the sea felt like a victory snatched from death itself. A young British seaman, barely 20, reached for a man clinging to a piece of the U-boat's shattered hull. Their fingers touched, then slipped. Without hesitation, the seaman leaped fully into the freezing water, grabbing the German by his collar and dragging him toward the rope. Both nearly went under, but the crew above hauled them in together, gasping, frozen, alive. On deck, soaked sailors worked in silence. There was no laughter, no boasting, only the heavy rhythm of compassion in motion. For hours, the Walker became not a warship, but a sanctuary, a fragile island of mercy adrift in an ocean of death. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a ghostly calm. The deck of HMS Walker was crowded with survivors, men wrapped in blankets, shivering, coughing, their eyes hollow but alive. 45 Germans had been pulled from the water. Half of them would have been dead within minutes if the rescue had not happened. The British crew moved among them quietly, offering hot tea, dry clothes, and bandages. No one spoke of sides anymore. The destroyer that had sunk their vessel now carried them to safety. Captain McIntyre stood near the railing, looking over the gray sea where the U-boat had vanished. He knew his decision would raise questions from the Admiralty. He might even face reprimand for risking the ship. But as he watched a rescued German sailor bow his head in gratitude, he understood something far greater, that this moment would outlive any report or punishment. War had rules, but humanity had its own laws, and sometimes it took the courage to break one to honor the other. The crew didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They just worked, quietly, deliberately, saving lives until the last voice in the sea was silent. As the sun rose weakly through the fog, the survivors began to stir. Some of the German sailors wept quietly. Others sat staring into the horizon, unable to comprehend that the very men who had destroyed their submarine were now tending to their wounds. Below deck, the atmosphere was heavy but peaceful. The British medical team worked shoulder to shoulder, wrapping frostbitten hands and cleaning cuts. One German sailor, his lips trembling, muttered, "We thought you'd let us die." The ship's doctor looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "Not today." In the mess hall, a few of the younger sailors shared bread with their former enemies. Conversation was sparse, limited to gestures and simple words. But the silence between them was not one of hatred, it was one of understanding. They had seen the same ocean swallow friends, the same cold steel life from the strongest of men. In that moment, uniforms no longer mattered. Later, when one of the rescued Germans saluted the British captain in respect, every man on board felt the weight of that gesture. A salute not to rank or nation, but to compassion itself. Days passed as HMS Walker continued its patrol toward the convoy routes, carrying the rescued Germans below deck. The tension that had once filled the ship began to dissolve. Hatred, once sharp as a blade, now softened into something neither side could name. One evening, a British sailor found himself sitting beside a young German radio man who had lost his brother in the attack. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they didn't need to. The Brit offered him a cigarette. The German accepted, hands shaking. They sat in silence, the smoke curling upward, the war momentarily forgotten. Elsewhere, some of the rescued men helped clean the deck. Others folded blankets, quiet gestures of respect for the men who had saved them. The destroyer had become a floating contradiction, a warship carrying enemies who now depended on each other for survival. Captain McIntyre observed it all from the bridge, feeling the shift in the air. Perhaps, he murmured to his first officer, the greatest victory in war is to remember you're still human. And for once, the ocean vast, cold, and cruel seemed to listen. The Atlantic had swallowed the U-boat whole, but it never erased what happened there. The sea kept its secrets, the wreck below, the cries above, and the strange peace that followed. For the men aboard HMS Walker, the ocean was no longer just a battlefield. It had become a mirror reflecting the cost of hatred, the weight of mercy, and the fragile line that separated one from the other. At night, the ship moved quietly through the black water. The rescued Germans slept in borrowed hammocks, while British sailors stood watch, their eyes scanning the horizon. Every man knew how easily they could have traded places. The wind whispered through the rigging like a ghostly reminder of those still lost beneath the waves. Yet among the survivors, there was a stillness, not of fear, but of reverence. They had witnessed something the war could never explain, compassion rising from destruction. Long after the battle logs were filed and medals awarded, the sea would remember, because the ocean never forgets the sound of mercy. When HMS Walker returned to port, there was no fanfare, no front-page headline, no official commendation. The report simply stated, "Enemy submarine destroyed. Survivors recovered." But among the crew, the memory lingered like a haunting melody. They knew what had happened, went far beyond duty. It was a rare act of grace in a world consumed by vengeance. The rescued Germans were transferred to a prisoner of war camp, treated according to the laws of war. Many of them never forgot the faces of the men who saved them. Years later, some would write letters of gratitude, messages that never made the newspapers, but changed hearts nonetheless. Captain McIntyre kept his silence. When asked about the event, he only said, "He did what was right." He never sought credit, never defended his choice. For him, it wasn't heroism, it was humanity. And so, the story drifted into obscurity, buried beneath decades of things forgotten, amid the grander tales of victories and losses. Yet somewhere in the vastness of the Atlantic, that moment still lived, a flicker of light that war could not extinguish. War had taken everything from those men, their homes, their friends, their peace. But in that freezing sea, it failed to take their compassion. That, above all, survived. For the sailors of HMS Walker, the rescue became a quiet legend, a story they rarely spoke of, yet carried in their hearts for the rest of their lives. They had faced the enemy and found something far greater than victory. They had found themselves. Years later, one of the British sailors would tell his grandson, "I learned that day that courage isn't just fighting it, choosing mercy when the world tells you not to." Across the sea, a former German submariner would say in an interview, "They showed us the meaning of honor. We were defeated, but we were saved by men of true strength. Time buried their ships, their uniforms, their names, but the act, that one impossible act of compassion lived on, echoing quietly across generations, because in the end, it wasn't the torpedoes, or the guns, or the orders that defined them. It was the humanity that refused to drown." Decades later, historians would rediscover fragments of the event, a log entry, a survivor's note, a faded photograph of men standing together on a storm-torn deck. The story resurfaced, not as a tale of victory, but as a testament to what humanity can be even in the midst of brutality. Naval museums began mentioning the Walker and its crew as an example of moral courage. Military academies quietly used the incident to teach a lesson rarely found in textbooks, that true leadership is measured not by destruction, but by mercy. For the descendants of both crews, the past became a bridge instead of a wound. Letters were exchanged, names remembered, and even wreaths laid together over the Atlantic where it all happened. The waves still rolled, indifferent and eternal. But for those who knew the story, that part of the sea no longer felt cold. It had been baptized by compassion, and in that baptism, war lost a little of its power. The destroyer and the U-boat had long since rusted into ghosts. But the spirit of those who lived that night remained unsinkable. The story of HMS Walker and the U-boat ISNT, just a tale from the past. It's a mirror for the present. In a world still torn by division, it reminds us that compassion is not weakness. It's the highest form of courage. When we remember these moments when men looked beyond flags and uniforms and chose to see each other as human, we keep history alive in the way it was meant to be told, not through the glory of war, but through the power of mercy. So if this story moved you, take a moment to like this video, share it, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Your support keeps these forgotten stories from fading into silence. Because history isn't just about who won the battles, it's about those who, even in darkness, chose the light. And as long as we tell their stories, they never truly sink beneath the waves.